Coming up right now. And then you can begin. And
All right.
I will also turn off my microphone. There you go.
Perfect. Well, welcome everyone. I'm so glad to see so many familiar faces and names. And thank you again to Emmy and Elle for helping me troubleshoot that issue. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Olivia Vald, and I'm very excited to share my learning with you all today. So I'd like to begin with a bit of context for you all. As I began my GT-ELS learning in February, I was asked to choose a Catalyst course to kickstart my research and to eventually guide me towards a thesis. Now, there were over 3,000 course options available, so choosing a Catalyst course was a bit overwhelming for me at first. As I scanned through the course options on a website called edX, I began considering a few questions. I began thinking about what's relevant in my life, what's important to me, what interests me, and how can my research work to better me as a human being. So I began with what's important to me. I thought immediately about my family and friends, my health, the wellness of others, and choosing a Catalyst course because I can't procrastinate that forever. I thought about what's relevant in my life, considering school and stress and how those two elements work together to impact me as a student. And then I thought about what interests me. And this year specifically, I've become interested in psychology. And I think that's a result of the classes I took this year and from lots of alone time in my brain throughout the pandemic and being at home. So this school year has been extremely abnormal for all students. Online classes in isolation have certainly taken a toll on the mental well-being of kids in schools. I see it in my peers and I feel it in myself. The stress and pressures of school can be intense during a normal school year, let alone with a pandemic added to that. Throughout the pandemic, we've all found ways to subconsciously or intentionally cope with the changes in our reality, whether that be going for a walk daily or FaceTiming a friend. I found that this new adoption of habits and hobbies was a common experience among my friends and family throughout the pandemic. And for me, that was in the form of learning to meditate. I found that a simple 10-minute daily practice helped me cope with pressures of school, stress, and isolation, and I began this with no experience. So considering these themes, I ended up settling on a Catalyst course through UC Berkeley titled The Science of Happiness. This course explored the meanings of happiness, key components of happiness, and ways happiness is cultivated in life. After my 8 weeks of research were completed, I began independent research in hopes of narrowing to a more streamlined topic. And as I was kind of looking through my past documentation, hoping a theme would jump out at me, I found that in most every piece of documented evidence, whether that be in my reflections or in notes, at some point I referenced the idea of mindfulness. And after finding this topic and doing more research, I crafted the thesis of for mindfulness exercises to be beneficial to all students and educators. Educators must examine implemented practices through an inclusive and equitable lens. So what is mindfulness? Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is the founder of the popular mindfulness-based stress reduction program, describes mindfulness as paying attention in a systematic way, including having presence of heart, and states, mindfulness is the awareness that arises by paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So what does mindfulness look like? Mindfulness can be practiced in various ways, but most commonly takes the form of meditation. Mindfulness can also be cultivated through physical movement, like through yoga, or through breathing exercises or visualizations. And mindfulness exercises help one to center on the idea of being intentional and in the present moment. Mindfulness practices often focus on the release of self-centeredness and on an influx of gratitude for the present moment and the present state of one's being. And mindfulness encompasses the idea of now, as the present moment is all we really ever have. As I began looking at the ideological side of mindfulness, I started to wonder, how do these practices really work to impact the participants? How do these practices work deeper than just a simple act of self-care or a new habit or hobby picked up during quarantine? And why is there such a push to engage in mindfulness practices? Connecting back to my Catalyst course, one of the first things I learned is that our reasons of happiness are determined from three major categories. 50% of our reasons for happiness are determined at the genetic level. 10% of our reasons come from life circumstances, and that leaves 40% of our reasons up to individuals as ourselves entirely in our power to change. Humans replace 1% of their cells in their body daily, and the latest studies show that emotion plays a large role in the pace of cell renewal. Data supports the notion that positive emotion literally changes who we are over time, though it takes practices such as mindfulness to do so. Mindfulness has a significant impact on the brain. And thanks to neuroplasticity, which is the human ability for humans to change the structures of their brain through the result of day-to-day experiences, the choices we make and the thoughts we think physically change the structure of our brains. And research shows that brain regions associated with awareness and empathy increased in connection after mindfulness practices. And mindfulness practices foster positive emotion, which in turn cause the brain to make changes which lead individuals to be more kind, compassionate, and present in their daily lives. The benefits of mindfulness do not stop at the brain. Impacts of mindfulness have also been shown to have large impacts on human behavior, beginning with increased awareness of emotions, better allowing individuals to be more aware of their thoughts and feelings and to funnel out negative thought patterns. Mindfulness has also been proven to help individuals stay focused and be less distractible. And there are a multitude of other impacts on human behavior that have really positive impacts on humans' lives. And we know that these impacts are true thanks to brain scans. A multitude of studies detecting activity in the left prefrontal cortex of the brain supports the notion that positive emotion literally changes who we are. So positive emotions such as joy, creativity, optimism, and compassion appear as activity in the left prefrontal cortex of the human brain. And negative emotions such as anxiety and fear appear as activity in the right prefrontal cortex of the brain. And mindfulness exercises have been shown to increase activity in the left to right ratio, meaning that an effort towards internal improvement, such as mindfulness, has a positive effect on the brain, further reflected through human behavior. And mindfulness practices also help humans tackle pain. In a study conducted by Jon Kabat-Zinn, whom I referenced earlier, patients who experienced chronic pain engaged in a 10-week mindfulness program where they practiced many mindfulness exercises through Jon Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction program. And the results were astounding and confirmed the claim that mindfulness can impact our perception of pain. The results showed that 65 of participants showed a 33% reduction in pain ratings, and 50% showed a greater than 50% reduction in pain. And the results showed that and confirmed the claim that mindfulness has a large impact on our perception of pain. So why is this? Mindfulness allows individuals to disassociate the sensory dimension of pain, which is how pain really feels, from the alarm reaction or emotional dimension of pain, which is how we perceive the sensation of pain. And in totality, the practice proved that mindfulness exercises allow patients to reduce the experience of suffering. So relating this to my life, mindfulness has also been proven to produce a multitude of positive effects that impact students. So research supports the notion that mindfulness aids in managing stress and toxic thoughts of perfectionism. And this is a really beneficial realization as toxic thoughts like perfectionism or extreme amounts of stress are extremely rampant among students in schools and elevated during extreme times like a pandemic. So for students to be able to cultivate these skills, it leads students to find more healthy coping mechanisms for common occurrences among students such as burnout or toxic thoughts of perfectionism or extreme stress. So the usage of mindfulness for students in schools is extremely beneficial, and this is something that I became very excited about in my research. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, 1 in 5 American children struggles with anxiety, and almost half of American children experience one major stressor at home, such as parents' addiction, divorce, or poverty. The increased usage of mindfulness in schools allows students who may lack mental health resources at home the skills they need to manage some of these extreme experiences and feelings of stress and anxiety. So while approaching this connection in my research, I became very excited about the connection of mindfulness in schools and this epidemic of anxiety and major stressors at home in children. And at first glance, it seemed that incorporating mindfulness in schools was a fairly uncomplicated idea. Um, I became excited because I thought that anyone with a functioning brain could reap the benefits of mindfulness and that school was a great place to begin cultivating those skills. But while recognizing the proven potential benefits of mindfulness, I previously failed to consider how mindfulness could be inaccessible to some students. As mindfulness becomes more popular in schools, researchers are examining how it may be beneficial to students facing trauma or to students who have extreme circumstances at home. And while gathering an understanding of how some of the potential benefits I explained earlier could help these students, researchers are also finding how delicate the implementation of these practices must be to truly benefit all students and to specifically benefit students facing adversity and injustice. Some of the most common mindfulness practices in schools take the form of short guided meditations, often in the form of videos, mindful approaches to tackling behavioral problems, breathing exercises, or simply as a break from learning. And the explosive popularity of mindfulness in schools has meant a range of different practices are being added to class time, not all of which have been proven or backed by science to be beneficial. For example, some for-profit organizations make videos or gadgets that are meant to be used in schools, but are often just lazily thrown into a lesson. And it's vital for educators to understand that to truly reap the benefits of mindfulness for all students, these videos and for-profit gadgets aren't always going to be beneficial, and that it's not inherently beneficial by just adding these things into a lesson. Educators must think critically about the message they're sending to their students while incorporating such methods. And in the United States specifically, mindfulness has long been associated with wealthy white individuals, individuals who would not understand many of the struggles facing minority students, specifically within the education system. Mindfulness becomes problematic when it is ignorant to the experiences and injustices of its participants. Examining this issue, it's extremely important to understand implicit bias. So, what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are unconscious stereotypes and attitudes that attribute specific qualities of an individual member to a social group. Implicit bias often targets individuals depending on race, sexuality, or gender. Implicit bias often leads educators to punish or treat students unfairly or to attribute misrepresentative characteristics to a student. And it's important to understand that incorporating mindfulness exercises into a school day is not going to eliminate the frustration and pain of students who are targets of implicit bias. In fact, the implementation of mindfulness in a space where implicit bias is present is extremely problematic and harmful. And many experts are worried about the message being sent to students regarding mindfulness is that when facing inequity or injustice in schools, that they should sit down and be quiet. Jay Ehrenholt, who is an expert on equitable mindfulness, encompasses this idea by stating, what we don't want to do is communicate to students that when their school system is failing them, the best thing you can do to cope is to sit still, be quiet, and compliant. Incorporating mindfulness programs without integrating culturally responsive practices is treating the systems of an inequitable education without addressing the root cause. Mindfulness without a teacher trained in both meditation and cultural competency may mistakenly teach students to resign themselves to inequity and injustice. So, although appearing to be extremely beneficial to its participants, mindfulness is not a one-size-fits-all method of problem solving and can easily become a dangerous excuse to avoid real, important, and impactful conversations about a school's culture and biases. Another way mindfulness in schools can be potentially harmful to students is by unintentionally triggering trauma from a student's life. Many mindfulness practices center on the breath. And while these practices are usually incorporated into a lesson with good intentions, it's extremely important for educators to understand how these practices may impact students with trauma differently. Um, Specifically, if students have endured a traumatic event where their airways have been cut off, asking a student to focus on the breath may be extremely triggering. And students who are asked to do these things may find that mindfulness practices are more uncomfortable than comforting. It's extremely important for educators to understand that while they're oftentimes and most times incorporating these mindfulness exercises with good intentions, students with trauma or with various past experiences may respond differently to these practices. Specifically, if students have specific events where they are asked to close their eyes and a traumatic event could resurface, or again, through the breath. So similarly, educators must be aware of how their language during mindfulness practices registers with students with trauma differently. Oftentimes, demanding language such as now do this or now do that may be very unapproachable to students with trauma. This is because oftentimes individuals with trauma find it extremely difficult to learn when they feel that they have no choice. The tone of an instructor's voice and word usage are elements that must be considered when incorporating mindfulness practices in order to make sure that all students can participate and feel comfortable doing so. Invitational language, such as if this is accessible to you, or if this feels comfortable to you, or you might try both and see which feels better, is much more approachable to individuals with trauma and should be incorporated in mindfulness exercises in place of demanding language to make sure that individuals with trauma can reap the same benefits as individuals who have not experienced trauma in their lives. As educators consider the various experiences of their students, they can begin to craft mindfulness exercises that meet the needs of their students. So, what can educators do to make mindfulness more accessible, inclusive, and equitable to all students? Educators' work of rooting out implicit bias and self-education of systems of oppression that impact students should be done before mindfulness exercises are carried into the classroom to avoid ignorant or harmful messaging within mindfulness practices. Mushi Makita, who is a meditation teacher and writer, whom I came across during my research, explains that because our society is full of structural and institutionalized forms of prejudice, the knowledge of such inequalities, injustices, and traumas, as well as carefully selected language, is vital to creating the most inclusive form of mindfulness. Educators should do the work of educating themselves on these systems of oppression before incorporating mindfulness practices in order to avoid ignorant messaging to students. Additionally, it would be most responsible for educators to be trained in or to learn more about mindfulness practices before carrying them into the classroom. When teachers have a deeper understanding of mindfulness and have experience, they're better able to help students when problems arise during practices. When implementing mindfulness practices in the classroom, educators should always make practices optional and ensure that students feel comfortable opting out of practices at any time. Educators should use carefully selected invitational language, and be aware of how their language, their word choice, and their choice of practice impacts students who have various experiences in life. Although it's impossible for educators to know exactly what each of their students have gone through the entirety of their lives, educators can make changes to their practices that allow students to feel more comfortable engaging in mindfulness. As a multitude of data and science supports, mindfulness has the potential to change the lives of its participants. Mindfulness can help individuals cope with pain, manage emotions, and better learn to cope with stressors. The benefits of mindfulness are astounding and have the potential to really impact students' lives through tackling toxic thoughts of perfectionism or even through their physical health. Although the benefits of mindfulness are exciting, it's vital for educators to assume the responsibility of first educating themselves on the various experiences of their students and gather an understanding of how the choices they make in incorporating mindfulness impacts students differently. The benefits of mindfulness can only be truly beneficial if they are inclusive and considerate of the needs and unique experiences of each student. Only by continually educating themselves on the experiences of their students and understanding how their choices in incorporating mindfulness impact students differently can educators ensure that the implementation of mindfulness practices in their schools are equitable, inclusive, and attainable to all students. So that is all I have for my presentation, and I want to thank you for listening, and I will now open the floor to any questions or comments.
I have a question. I'll pop in. Okay.
Yes.
So I have two questions. So you said in your very professional presentation, thank you very much, that educators need to build our experiences. What suggestions do you have for the audience that are perhaps educators on how they could build those experiences?
Yeah, I think that for educators and teachers, it's important that they hone in on their personal experiences in mindfulness, because having an instructor who is more experienced is going to be more beneficial for students when they have questions about mindfulness, or um, maybe are struggling with concentrating. Having an instructor that has more experience is going to be more beneficial to those students. So maybe that's practicing mindfulness on your own, or teaming up with other educators who are interested. That could also be in the form of just researching about mindfulness, about its origins, about again, how mindfulness impacts different people with different experiences. I think those are all really great ways to gain experience.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Hi, Olivia. My name is Janelle, and I think you did a really great job today. I appreciate it. I actually manage the well-being team at Wellmark, and so this topic was particularly of interest to me. I'm curious, in your research, and I apologize, I was not able to link into your blog, so you may have had some of this. In your research, did you find anything about how much students would find mindfulness practice techniques something that they would even be willing to do? So
Yeah.
are they open to those types of things, or do they think it's silly or whatever?
Yeah, I think a lot of that depends on age, and that's kind of falls on educators as well to choose practices that are appropriate to different ages. So for more elementary students, maybe it's after recess coming inside and doing breathing exercises. And maybe in high school, that looks like before you take a test, closing your eyes, taking a minute, doing affirmations or reassuring yourself. But I think that when students are presented with the science and data behind how these things can impact your lives, or speak to students who have experiences, or talk to people with credibility, I think that's really helpful in kind of motivating kids to engage in these things. And that begins with just sharing that information. So I think when kids, and especially high school students, when they learn that, there are healthy ways to cope with stress and prevent burnout, I think that's a really exciting thing. But a lot of that is just providing that information to kids, and that falls on educators.
Thank you. And have you seen any techniques implemented at Roosevelt, or in any other situation that you've been that you thought were particularly successful?
Yeah, one experience I had, I don't know if Miss Snyder's here, but my AP US history class that's at Central, before tests, we would kind of just like take a moment she kind of left it open to what you want to do, but just like a quiet moment to relax. And I found that to be really helpful, because a lot of times students right before a test are like cramming, trying to do like a Quizlet or rush and cram information. And that's something that I had previously done before, practicing in her class, just taking a moment and reassuring myself that I have the information I need. Um, and I found that that was extremely helpful. And that's one of the things that actually inspired me to look deeper into mindfulness, and specifically how it can impact students.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer.
Anybody else?
I have a question, Olivia.
Yes.
Can you share one or two things that were most surprising to you through your research?
Yeah, so One of the things, and I talked to Miss Dunley quite frequently about this, because when we would meet to talk about my research, I would be constantly in shock about how exciting a lot of the research is behind mindfulness. But just like the physical elements, I was aware that mindfulness can have really great benefits on, having a more positive outlook or being more compassionate or open to change, but I never really previously considered how it can impact our physical state. So the structure of our brain, the length of our lives, things like that, just the physical elements in general were all really surprising to me and really motivated me to continue practicing mindfulness. So I would say that's the biggest thing that was exciting and surprising to me.
Great, thank you.
Anybody else?
I have two questions. I know you know what one of them is, but because we've talked about it, but I thought maybe it could help the audience. What do you use to help you practice mindfulness, and something that might be something the audience members could try also?
Yeah, so I first started my short meditations through an app called Headspace. And I actually ended up getting a subscription to it, but I don't think that everybody needs the specific app or even a specific like subscription to begin cultivating these practices. And I think that there are so many resources online if you're open to like doing guided meditations, or even I've taken a lot of the things I've learned from guided meditation and just practiced them myself. So whether that be how the brain recognizes thoughts or learning to concentrate on the breath. So that's how I began learning about mindfulness and practicing myself, but I've taken a lot of those skills and incorporated them in other places of my life. So if you find mindfulness or specifically meditation to be hard for you at first, I recommend doing guided meditations or even just practice focusing on your breath.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I know I still have to set up my reminder, but yes, it was fun learning with you this year. I have one more question. So were there any resources, and now I can't remember if you included some in your blog, that would help be like a PD for teachers to understand this? There's a push in Des Moines Public Schools for social emotional learning, but I think it's important that they do understand like the research that you've gathered about, the things you need to stop and think about, like trauma. Do they give you any resources that you should share with teachers?
Yeah, I have a few articles that are really interesting and kind of I used in crafting my presentation. So if any educators are on the call and would like me to send that information along, it's also incorporated in a few of my blog posts. But one of the articles I found was from an educator who had incorporated these things and kind of was learning about invitational language and how important that is. But I think a lot of it begins with just conversations between educators, talking about how this could potentially impact the lives of students, and passing that information along is really important. And even this does not have to be like a huge change to the format of class. It could be something that is well thought out and incorporates a lot of the elements that I talked about today very carefully, implemented into the classroom, could be over time really beneficial to students. But I think that begins with just conversations between teachers and teachers educating themselves on the various aspects of mindfulness and how it can impact their students. Anybody
Excellent.
else have any questions? You can throw them in the chat too. All right, if nobody else has anything, I just want to thank you all for coming today and listening to what I have to say. This has been a really exciting thing for me to learn about, so I was very excited to share with everyone. So I hope everybody has a great rest of their day and a great long weekend, and thank you for coming.
And everyone, you should have got an email from me last night that that has a reflection form or an audience feedback form in the email and attached to the email that you can fill out to give feedback to Olivia. So if you can send that to her and to me, that would be excellent. So look for that email. And if you didn't get one, email me and I will send it out to you again. And thanks so much for your time. I'm going to stop recording now, Olivia.
Thank you. Good job, Liv.